I have a question for you. And it's like stomping ants at a picnic. You just can't fix everything. But I wonder how much we could fix if we just stopped rewarding bad behavior. That's probably the most fundamental psychological principle. You go back to Pavlov, Skinner, just don't reward bad behavior, because you reward behavior you want to see reoccur. You don't reward bad behavior you want to extinguish. And it seems to me we are rewarding bad behavior in so many different ways, like paying people to stay home and not work. Are you kidding me? What's wrong with supply chain? Well, you're paying people not to work. What's wrong with the entertainment and hospitality industry? You're paying people not to work. Are you kidding me? We're rewarding bad behavior. Couldn't we do a lot of good with just some fundamental psychological principles like don't reward bad behavior?
Yes, or if you don't have something nice to say, don't say it, which your mother told you.
That'd dry up the conversation a lot, wouldn't it?
Well, but you know what? There are people out there, I'll name names. On the Republican side, Tim Scott doesn't know how to do negative. The senator from South Carolina, the person who did the State of the Union response to Joe Biden last year, Tim Scott's thinking about running for president. If he runs, there won't be a negative campaign. It'll be a positive, hopeful, soul-based campaign. Or Ben Sasse, the senator from Nebraska. This is a guy who's probably the smartest member of the United States Senate. And the guy just doesn't do negative. He's as interested in family as he is in policy. On the Democratic side, Mitch Landrieu, the former mayor of New Orleans. The guy cares more about people. He's the most humanistic candidate I've ever met in my life. Michael Bennet, the senator from Colorado, who before he was appointed senator was in charge of education, was in charge of public schools, or Cory Booker, who ran for president. These are people who are political and partisan, but they care about the individual and they care about society. And they choose to see the best in people rather than the worst. There are a few people left in politics, but they're so few and far between. And our current president, he made a commitment to be civil. He made a commitment to be a centrist. He made a commitment to act responsibly. And I'll leave it up to your listeners, because I'm not going to do politics here, whether or not he's achieved that. But it can be done. We are not that far gone. The problem is, I don't think anyone will do it. That's the problem.
Really? Because the price is too high?
Because every expert says you have to go negative. Every expert says you have to destroy your opponent. Because Donald Trump doesn't know the positive. Donald Trump only knows how to attack. And many of the things that he attacks are legitimate targets. If you say something nice about Donald Trump, every Democrat stops listening. If you criticize Donald Trump, every one of his supporters stops listening. That's the problem. Donald Trump was good in some ways and bad in others. Joe Biden was good in some ways, or has been good in some ways, is not in others. There is goodness in everyone, with the exception of Putin, who I do believe, I don't understand these people who try to defend him, because I see no goodness in Vladimir Putin. But in these American politicians, there's something good and something bad, and we don't have the ability. I'm going to throw the question back to you. I agree with what you just concluded, that we've been rewarding bad behavior. How do we get people to be willing to accept that the left doesn't have every answer, the right doesn't have every answer, that we would do so much better by picking and choosing rather than just by signing up to tribes and rejecting everything from the tribe that we're not in?
People say politics are local, and I disagree. I think politics are personal. I think at some point, they may not want to say it because it would seem selfish, but I think at some point people sit down and say, what's in this for my family? What's in this for me? Whether it's a piece of legislation or it's a candidate, I think people sit down and say, is this going to help me feed my family? Is this going to help me feel safe? Is this going to help me have a future that I can live with? at many different levels. I think we've gotten so afraid that we've become sheep. I think people need to get their self-worth and their self-esteem intact. And even if they don't feel comfortable saying it out loud, I think they need to at least have a conversation with themselves about what's really important to them and not allow themselves to be marketed, programmed, and swept along in some kind of a zeitgeist. And I think people have stopped thinking for themselves enough. That's why I say I'm optimistic. I think people can be inspired to do that, inspired to think for themselves. I don't think that's happened enough. And maybe they don't feel like they want to go down to a town hall meeting and stand up and declare this or declare that. But I do think we can encourage people to think for themselves and vote their conscience, even if they don't feel comfortable going public about it. That hasn't happened.
There are 3 skills that are essential to this. The first is learning how to ask questions. We know how to make statements, but how do you ask a question that doesn't automatically bias or determine the result? And it's asking it so you get genuine insight, not just a simple answer. Americans don't know how to ask questions anymore. Number 2 is how do we actually hear what somebody is saying rather than putting it through our own filter? To accept what's coming back to us and process it from their perspective, not just from our perspective. And third is not just to be living in the present, but also to be living in the future. That we tend to react to things as they are impacting us right now, which is not at all how the founding fathers saw this country when they were putting it together. They were making decisions based on what would happen 50 or 100 years from then, rather than what happens to us right now, today, this hour. I think if we learn those 3 attributes, we'll be a stronger country and we'll be a better people.
If somebody's coming in with an agenda and they're just trying to gotcha with a politician to prove something up or to get that viral moment, that's not a dialogue. That's not a question. But the questions I ask come from 2 sources. One is, I think I have a natural curiosity where the next question just presents itself. Somebody says something and it's like, well, given that, I want to know this. And the other is, I try to ask the question I really think the viewer wants to know the answer to. The questions write themselves. Like, I want to know about this France t-shirt you've got on.
Yes, and the reason why I wore this is because yesterday was the most important French election in a generation.
Right.
And the President Macron was successful, but there's going to be a runoff. And his lead over his opponent, his next most popular opponent, Le Pen, was very narrow. And depending on who gets elected in a couple of weeks, it will determine the future not just of France, but of Europe and potentially of the opposition to Ukraine. And so I wear this shirt because it's particularly relevant to our conversation today. Decisions that you all who are listening to Dr. Phil and myself right now, the decisions that you will make in the primaries that you're facing across the country and the general election in 2022, we don't have to wait to 2024. How you vote will decide the future of this country. And I'm emphasizing that in this t-shirt, and I emphasize that in our conversation, that your voice matters and so does your vote. And when you use your voice and your vote, you can make a difference.
I want to add something to that I think is really important. I think people underestimate the importance of local elections. Judges, all of these local elections have so much impact on the quality of their day-to-day life, and oftentimes they don't get that far down on the ballot.
And they vote for a party. So
Yeah,
they
exactly.
may get that far, but they have no idea who's running for office. And those local elections often determine the taxes that you pay. They determine the local parks. They determine the garbage collection. They determine your quality of life more than what anyone in Washington does. So not only should you pay attention because it's your responsibility, you should pay attention because your life is going to be impacted by the people who are responsible right there in your town or your community.